Good morning, my name's Alan Davis and it's a pleasure to be with you today and to share God's Word. Our reading will come from Luke chapter 9 verses 1 to 10 and I've entitled the talk, Training Jesus Style. Now I was an air cadet in my teens, 1344 Squadron No. 1 Welsh Wing Cardiff, and it certainly taught me the discipline I lacked in my earlier years. It was the only place where I'd allow others to tell me what to do without reacting in an unpleasant manner. It trained me to obey commands and to do what was asked of me without fuss and bother. I'd learned to trust the officers and enjoy parade ground drill, and I left age 18 having attained the rank of a Cadet 1 officer. However, some types of training are never fun, but they have a purpose and therefore are usually required to obtain the necessary skills to do a job. Now Jesus' disciples needed training also. Unbeknown to them, they were being groomed to take over Jesus' work when he died. And so he was going to have to whip them into shape sooner or later. This morning, I want us to take a look at one of Jesus' training exercises that he prepared for the disciples and look at what we can learn from it. Because we are carrying on the tradition of the disciples in being Jesus' hands, mouth and ears here on this earth. So the things the disciples learned, we need to learn. So let's turn to the reading. When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them authority to drive out demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. He told them, "Take nothing for the journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, leave their town and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them." So they set out and went from village to village, proclaiming the good news and healing people everywhere. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard what was going on, and he was perplexed because some were saying that John had been raised from the dead, others that Elijah had appeared, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago had come back to life. But Herod said, "I beheaded John. Who then is this I hear such things about?" And he tried to see him. When the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus what they had done. Then he took them with him, and they withdrew by themselves to a town called Bethsaida. Now at the time our reading is happening, the disciples had been with Jesus for about 2 years. They were in their 3-year apprenticeship, remember, so they must have been getting to the stage where they were understanding much of what Jesus was talking about. So here in this account, Jesus sends them out of the classroom to do some practical work on their own. This was part of their training and was therefore necessary. So let's look at the 5 lessons we can learn from their training. Lesson 1 is we must answer Jesus' call. In verse 1 we read that the disciples were called together and they responded. Many commentaries think it's unlikely that the disciples remained at Jesus' side for the whole of the 3-year apprenticeship. They had homes and families, and some of them lived in the areas of Capernaum and the surrounding villages. So it's highly likely that some of them were visiting with friends and family when Jesus' call came to them. And when they received Jesus' call, they came. This symbolises the first step in becoming one of Jesus' disciples. We need to be called by Jesus, and we need to respond to that call if we want to be Jesus' disciples. God calls us to serve him and to follow him. In his calling, he calls us to be ministers and priests. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, for which God prepared in advance for us to do. And that's in Ephesians 2 verse 10. God has some works of service for you to do for him, and he has called you to do those things. So the first thing that is needed, therefore, is to answer Jesus' call and to say, "Yes, I'll do it." This is what the disciples did. They came together and then Jesus told him his plan. Let's look at the second lesson, that our calling is to preach and heal. The disciples were to go on a preaching and healing tour through the villages. And although it's not stated, I'm sure at this point they started to feel a bit fearful. Unfortunately, like the disciples, many of us, me included, balk at serving God and doing the things which He has commanded us to do. We'd far prefer to sit in church and sing and theorise about the questions of faith than have to go outside the church and minister to others. I'm sure the disciples felt this way also, because they were human just like you and me. A story. A tutor was teaching at a Bible college, and it occurred to him one day that the students were spending an excessive amount of time at their desks and immersed in study. He realised that they needed a practical experience that would go hand in hand with their studies. So he organised things with a church in a nearby city and asked if the students could come and gain some practical experience on the streets of their city. When all the details had been worked out, he went to his students and shared the upcoming events with them. Immediately, the class experienced a very strange epidemic. Everyone got sick and couldn't go. One young man came to the tutor and said, "I can't go." "Why not?" asked the tutor. "Because I've lost my voice," the young man replied. "Why should that stop you from going?" asked the tutor. "I can't communicate," said the young man. The tutor countered, "You just communicated with me despite the fact you've lost your voice, so you shouldn't have any problems. Anyway, you haven't lost your voice. You're feeling cowardly. You're afraid." "No," said the young man with even less of a voice. "I've lost my voice." "Let me tell you something," said the tutor. "You're afraid. I'm afraid. Everyone here is afraid. But we're going." The young man looked stunned and then said with a fully recovered voice, "You're scared?" The tutor said he learned 2 new spiritual gifts that day: healing and discernment. None of us like the prospect of going and sharing the gospel. We're all scared of it, but this is what Jesus calls his followers to do. I think it's interesting what Jesus commissions them to do. It is to seek to help others spiritually and physically. We are sent into the world to preach the gospel. The Great Commission in Mark 16 verse 15 says, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned." But this is not the end of it. Verse 17 says, "And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues." And in the last part of verse 18, "They will place their hands on sick people and they will get well." Not only will we preach the good news of Jesus, but we will perform miraculous deeds, drive out demons, speak in tongues, heal sick people. God is still calling us to preach and heal. Why? Because he's interested in the eternal destiny of people and also their current state of pain. He wants to heal people fully. Do you believe this will happen? Could you do it? Or is it only for those special people to do? But this doesn't lessen the fear that we have of going. When we're called, will we go? But the third lesson we need to learn is that we will minister with Jesus' power and authority. As we've just said, very few of us relish the prospect of going and sharing the gospel. But we need to remember that we don't do it in our own strength. We minister with Jesus' power and authority. Jesus called disciples and then he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and cure diseases. This is an important lesson we need to learn. Anyone Jesus calls, he equips. Do you ever doubt that you've got what it takes to do what God asks you to do? Maybe you feel a tug to help out with youth work or elderly care, or to participate in pastoral care, but you've never done it before and you wonder if you have the gifts it requires. Well, if God is calling you to do something, he will equip you. The disciples were being called to preach and heal. They didn't have any great oratory skills or healing gifts, but Jesus gave them his power and his authority so that they could accomplish the task: preach, drive out demons, and cure the sick. Paul experienced exactly the same thing when he was called in 1 Corinthians 2 verses 4 and 5. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with the demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. When we come to serve Jesus, we need to put away our fears and take on the resources that Jesus offers to us. So what are the resources? Firstly, there's power. Power is the ability to accomplish a task. Jesus had the power to calm storms, drive out demons, heal the sick and dying. We ourselves do not have that power, but Jesus offers us his power, and if we take it, then we are able to wield that power to accomplish things that you or I could never imagine. And that takes real faith, and very few of us are willing to take that step. Secondly, there's authority. Authority is different to power. It's what the policeman has when they put out their hand for you to stop. They don't have the physical power to make you stop, but they have the right to make you stop. Jesus offers us his authority. No demon's going to listen to you or me because we don't have authority over them. But when we've been invested with Jesus' authority, then we can make things happen. We are called to preach and heal, and we are equipped to accomplish these tasks with Jesus' power and authority. This is an important lesson for us to learn. Don't be fearful of ministry. Rather accept it and use Jesus' power and authority to accomplish what Jesus has for you to do. The fourth lesson we need to learn from this training exercise is that Jesus promises to provide for the needs when we step out in faith and follow him. Jesus told his disciples they weren't to take anything at all, not staffs, not a bag, not food, not money, not even spare clothes. Instead, they were to trust God and rely on his provision. When they entered a town, they were to find someone who was willing to give them a bed, and they were to accept this hospitality and left the town. How would you feel being sent out with absolutely nothing, wondering where tomorrow's food would come from or where your bed would be tonight? This is how the disciples felt. But remember, this was a training exercise. Jesus didn't send his disciples out without preparation. In Luke 22, he tells them at another time to go out with a bag, with a purse of money, and even buy a sword to take with them. So, in our reading, he's not trying to set a precedent here for us to follow. Rather, it's all part of the training. The disciples needed to learn to trust God for their day-to-day needs. They needed to prove to themselves that God was faithful and would take care of them. They needed to learn that often the work at hand is so important that they needed to guard against the distractions of the activities of daily life. So when they returned, they all came back and reported how God had looked after them, and I'm sure their faith had grown. When God calls you to minister for him, you need to learn that God will provide for your needs, physical, emotional, social, and spiritual needs. We need to learn to trust God. The last lesson we need to learn from this exercise is that we mustn't waste our time on those who reject the message. Jesus tells his disciples, whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, shake the dust off your feet when you leave the town as a testimony against them. Now, it was a custom for Jewish rabbis returning from home to shake the dust from their feet as they crossed the border back into Israel after travelling to another country. They felt strongly that the land of Israel was a blessed nation and that all other nations were heathen and condemned, that they didn't want to carry any of the defiled Gentile soil into their country. So this became a symbol to the Gentiles that they were defiled and rejected. But now Jesus tells his disciples to do the same thing when an Israeli village rejects them. Imagine the insult this would cause. The disciples were travelling round village to village in Israel. For Jesus to tell his disciples to shake the dust off their feet when they leave a village that rejects you, he's saying, show them by your actions that they're no better off than the heathen Gentiles. Anyone who rejects the message is rejecting Jesus and therefore rejecting God. They're heathens no matter what race they are or how nice they are. I think it's amazing that Jesus doesn't tell his disciples to try and persuade them that they've made a mistake. Contrast Jesus' attitude here with ours. Jesus said, preach the gospel to them, and if they respond, great, stay and teach them. If they don't, move on. We in the West here say, if at first we don't succeed, try and try again. If they don't respond, we just need to pray a bit more. If they're not interested, we just need to find something they're interested in to invite them to. If they don't agree with us, we just need to live a Christian life so they see how good it is. No, Jesus says, don't waste your time. Move on to those who are dying in sin, who will accept your preaching. This may be hard to hear, but we can waste time trying with the same individuals when there are so many out there who have not heard the word and know nothing of the gospel. It's a huge challenge to us Western Christians. Here around Portsmouth there are loads of churches and anyone can walk into a church whenever they wanted to. We have national radio stations which people can hear the gospel on. You can buy a Bible in most bookshops or on the internet. But most people in Portsmouth have a colleague and a friend or neighbour who is Christian. But sadly, very few of them will have heard about Jesus in some point of their lives. And those that have will have chosen to reject him. Now, get me straight. I'm not saying that we should only tell them once and then leave. But neither should we kid ourselves that we are being effective by trying to get blood out of a stone. Instead of moving resources to parts of the harvest field where the fruits are ripe for harvest, we continue to persist in trying to crack the hard nuts where they are. Why is this? It's because we're comfortable where we are now. Is it because we really don't care about the millions of people in this world that are dying in sin without hearing about Jesus? One of the lessons we need to learn from this training exercise is that the task before us is urgent, and we can't afford to waste all our time and resources on the resistant hearts around us. So a reminder, here are the 5 lessons we need to learn. We must answer Jesus' call. Our calling is to preach and heal. We minister with Jesus' power and authority. That Jesus will provide for our needs. And we don't waste our time on those who reject Jesus. I want to close by telling you a story. As I tell it, try to identify with the character you are most like. Once upon a time there was an apple grower who had 10,000 acres of apple orchards. One day he went to the nearby town and he hired 1,000 apple pickers. He told them, go to my orchard, harvest the ripe apples and build storage buildings for them so they won't spoil. I need to be gone for a while, but I'll provide all you need to complete the task, and when I return, I'll reward you for your work. I'll set up a society for picking apples. The society to which you will all belong will be responsible for the entire operation. Naturally, in addition to those of you doing the actual harvesting, some will have to carry supplies, others will have to care for the physical needs of the group, and still others will have administrative responsibilities. So he set up the society, and some people volunteered to be pickers and others to be packers. Others put their skill to work as truck drivers, cooks, accountants, storehouse builders, apple inspectors, and even administrators. Every one of his workers could, of course, have picked apples. But in the end, however, only 100 of the 1,000 employees wound up as full-time pickers. Now the 100 pickers started harvesting immediately. 94 of them began picking around the farmhouse. The remaining 6 looked out towards the horizon and decided to head out to the faraway orchards. Before long, the storehouses in the 800 acres immediately surrounding the farmhouse had been filled by the 94 pickers with beautiful, delicious apples. However, with most of the pickers concentrating on those 800 acres, those trees were soon picked nearly bare. In fact, the 94 apple pickers working around the farmhouse began to have difficulty finding trees which had not been picked. As the apple picking slowed down around the farmhouse, society members began channeling their efforts into building larger storehouses and developing better equipment for picking and packing. They even started a school to train prospective apple pickers to replace those who would one day be too old to pick apples. Sadly, those 94 pickers working around the farmhouse began fighting amongst themselves. Incredible as it may sound, some began stealing apples that had already been picked. And though there were trees on the 10,000 acres to keep every available worker busy, those working nearest the farmhouse failed to move into the unharvested areas. They just kept working those 800 acres nearest the house. With all that activity, the harvest on the remaining 9,200 acres was left to just 6 pickers. Those 6, of course, were far too few to gather all the ripe fruit in those thousands of acres. So by the hundreds and thousands, apples rotted on the trees and fell to the ground. One of the students at the apple picking school showed a special talent for picking apples quickly and effectively. And when he heard about the thousands of acres of untouched faraway orchards, he started talking about going there. His friends discouraged him. "Your talents and abilities will be wasted, and you're very valuable around the farmhouse. Your gifts can help us harvest apples from the trees in our central 800 acres far more rapidly. That'll give us more time to build bigger and better storehouses. Perhaps you could even devise better ways of using the storehouses, since we've wound up with more space than we need for the present crop of apples." With so many workers and so few trees, the pickers and packers and truck drivers and all the rest of the society for the picking of apples living around the homestead had time for more than just picking apples. They built nice houses and raised the standards of living. Some became very conscious of styles of clothing. Thus, when the 6 pickers from the far-off orchards returned to the farmhouse for a visit, it was apparent they were not keeping up with the styles in vogue with the other apple pickers and packers. To be sure, those at the farmhouse were always good to the 6 who worked in the far-away orchards. When any of those 6 returned, they were given the red carpet treatment. Nonetheless, those 6 pickers were saddened that the Society of Picking of Apples spent 96% of its budget for bigger and better apple picking methods and equipment and personnel for the 800 acres around the homestead, while it spent only 4% of its budget on those distant orchards. Those 6 apple pickers knew that an apple is an apple, wherever it may be picked. They knew that the apples around the farmhouse were just as important as the apples far away. Still, they could not erase from their minds the sight of thousands of trees which had never been touched by the picker. They longed for more pickers to come and help them. They longed for help from the packers, truck drivers, supervisors, equipment maintenance men and ladder builders. They wondered if the professionals working back around the farmhouse could teach them better apple picking methods so that when they were out working, fewer apples would rot and fall to the ground. one might question whether the society was doing all the owner wanted done. The members did keep very busy. Several members were convinced that proper apple picking requires nothing less than the very best equipment. Thus, the society assigned several members to develop bigger and better ladders as well as nicer boxes to store the apples. The society prided itself on having raised the qualification level for full-time apple pickers. When the owner returns, the society members will crowd around him. They'll proudly show off the bigger and better ladders they built and the nice apple boxes they designed and made. One wonders how happy the owner will be. However, when he looks out and sees the acres and acres of untouched trees with their unpicked apples. Now Jesus called us to go and preach and heal. There are apples all over this world rotting on a tree that Jesus needs to get a message to. The task is urgent. Jesus tells us to go and work in his power and rely on him for all our needs. The big question is, are you willing to obey his call? If you're one of Jesus' followers, then this message is for you. What lessons are you going to learn?